Hi everyone. Before we begin, we would just like to give a shout out to the sponsor of this episode, Best Fiends. Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. Listener discretion is advised. The Orkney Islands are an archipelago of 70 islands, 20 of which are inhabited, which lies off the north coast of mainland Scotland, where the North and the Norwegian seas meet. All of Orkney is famed for its beauty and wild, rugged seascapes, drawing in substantial tourism from around the world every year, despite its remote location. The largest island among those in the archipelago is called Mainland, and is host to the largest of Orkney's towns, Kirkwall, as well as 75% of the total population of the islands. As well as being its largest town, Kirkwall is Orkney's administrative centre and has been documented in history since the 11th century. It is 40 miles in a straight line across the water from the nearest stretch of mainland Scotland at John O'Groats, and 150 miles from the nearest city, Inverness. Slightly over 10,000 people live within the boundaries of Kirkwall, mostly earning their keep through the maritime industries, which either call the island home or dock at Kirkwall's ferry port. Due to the influx of wealth the dock brings, the area is relatively prosperous, with several independent stores and a variety of restaurants which are not present throughout the remainder of the island. One such restaurant was the Mumutaz at 7 Bridge Street, owned by Moina Mia, which served Indian and Bangladeshi food to hungry travellers, locals and everyone in between. During holiday season, the Mumutaz always required extra pairs of hands. With Orkney seeing somewhere in the region of 170,000 non-native visitors throughout the year, with most of those in the peak summer holiday season, the need for extra labour to help service the demand wasn't solely a problem for the Mumutaz. A 26-year-old Bangladeshi-born waiter, Shamsuddin Mahmood, known to friends as Shamol, had frequently been phoning the Mumutaz to try and get one of the seasonal jobs. Shamol was living in London and was engaged to his girlfriend, who had remained in Bangladesh. Despite this, he headed up to Kirkwall in April of 1994, having been offered a role by the Mumutaz immediately upon receiving his application. Shamol Mahmood's appointment was not entirely unexpected, given that he had previously been on the island for 9 months in 1993. During his previous time on the island, he had also been working in the Mumutaz Restaurant and had loved the island, seeing it as a home away from home. Shamol was held in good regard by those in charge, and within a week of the call, he was living in the rented apartment above the Mumutaz next to the Mia family, and ready to enjoy some time on the island. Shamol's initial weeks in Kirkwall passed without any incidents of note. Shamol was a well-liked and well-spoken man. The locals didn't know a grand deal about him or his background, but they knew he had come to work on the island and had a pleasant manner and kindly disposition. Some of the islanders, somewhat cut off from the mainland and its wild variety of fashion, found his appearance unique, given Shamol wore oversized glasses with tinted orange lenses and wore loudly patterned silk shirts. The remainder of his appearance was relatively mundane by comparison. Should you have asked someone who knew him to describe him, The only remaining points of remark would have been that his face was never without a smile, and his hair was jet black, growing long and curly, and styled down at the back in a mullet. There may have been one further aspect of Shamol's appearance which was unusual to the locals. Kirkwall itself was, and to this day is, overwhelmingly white. In 2018, only 0.7% of all Orkney Island residents self-identified as being from a non-white ethnic group. In 1994, this number would likely have been less again. Given the small population of the island, Shamol and the family of his employer, Moina Mia, would have been some of only a few non-white faces living within Kirkwall at the time. Shamol's background being different from those around him initially never gave him any immediate cause for concern, given that Orkney had low levels of crime generally, and racially motivated crime was not common on the island. Orkney's crime levels were so low that it hadn't seen a murder since 1969, a fact almost unheard of elsewhere in Scotland. All Shamol's background meant was that given the overwhelming whiteness of the population, he would have felt visible. Sometimes that would have perhaps even ventured into feeling uncomfortable due to glances from curious islanders as they dined in the Mumutaz. The only incident of note happened on the 31st of May 1994. A group of intoxicated young islanders were removed from the Mumutaz for being rowdy. Shamol was in charge of the restaurant that evening, and it was his duty to remove them when they became a nuisance for other customers. There was a little bit of scuffling and shouting as they were removed. After this, it is alleged that two other islanders of the same age joined in with the shouting and began abusing Shamol about his skin colour. One looked him dead in the eye and stated, "I'm going to shoot you," which, according to a witness, he then repeated, then went off into the night. A shaken Shamol returned to the restaurant to finish his shift. The incident was never reported to the police, likely because Shamol loved the island and its people. Perhaps he didn't think that such menace spoke to his experience on Orkney and wanted to give the islander a chance to think on what he had done. I'm Jess, and this is Skinwalker. On June 2, 1994, at 4:30 p.m, Shamol was once again on shift, serving customers of the Mumutaz. He was working alongside another of the restaurant's managers, a local woman named Marion Flaws. The shift was passing without incident, a welcome relief after the events a few nights previous. The biggest party in the restaurant were the families of two local businessmen, Donald Glue and his brother-in-law, who all sat in quiet conversation as they waited for their food. At 7:15 p.m, the quiet ambience of the evening was disturbed as the door to the Mumutaz was forcibly opened. A man entered the premises wearing a hoodie and a balaclava mask, brandishing a pistol in his hand. Marion Flaws didn't react, thinking it was someone in fancy dress playing a disturbing trick. The man, however, walked straight past Marion Flaws, making a beeline for Shamol Mahmood. At this point, Marion began to suspect they were being robbed. When the masked man was only a yard from Shamol, he lifted his gun. Without saying a word, the man quickly aimed and shot Shamol at point-blank range. Shamol fell to the floor, bleeding profusely. Those in the restaurant sat transfixed. They knew what they had to do by going to his aid, but it was fruitless. He was dead before he had hit the floor. As Shamol's body had fallen to the ground, his blood and flesh had splattered on the daughter of Donald Glue. Donald and his brother-in-law abandoned their meals and gave chase to the gunman, fearing if he were not scared off, he would turn his weapon on the young children in the restaurant. As they ran towards him, he fled the building. The man quickly raced down a lane adjacent to the restaurant, with Glue and his brother-in-law in close pursuit. As the gravity of the man's actions set in, they ceased the chase in case they too fell victim to the fleeing man's pistol. Marion Flaw too had headed out of the Mumutaz to give chase. Rather than going down the lane which the gunman and Glue had raced, she tried to head the man off through a route at the other side of the building. The man did not fall into the trap, heading straight onto a lane which merged with the one he had started down, rather than looping around the building to where Marion Flaw stood. The masked man was never seen by anyone inside the restaurant again. As Marion, Donald and his brother-in-law all gave chase to the gunman, Kukon Udin, the son of Moina Mia who owned the Mumutaz, had heard the gunshot ring out. Unsure what had happened, he turned off the video which he was watching and went down to the restaurant. He was greeted with the scene of Shamol's lifeless body and blood pooled over the restaurant floor. Once the parties still inside the Mumutaz were unfrozen from the shock of the scene in front of them, the police were alerted to the incident. A local doctor who was at a nearby event rushed to the scene when he had been told of the incident. Word travels exceptionally fast on island communities, and he arrived before the police and ambulances. He pronounced Shamol dead at the scene. At only 26 years old, a friend to all who would have him, and forgiving of those who would not, Shamsuddin Shamol Mahmood had died mere weeks after coming to his home away from home. Calls to the police had gone up almost immediately after the shooting. The local police station had sent officers who arrived 10 minutes after the incident, but they were thoroughly under-equipped to deal with a crime of this magnitude, and they knew it. 25 years without a murder meant that they had never had the opportunity to put their training into practice. As such, the first call that Alistair MacLeod, Orkney's senior police officer, made was to the Northern Constabulary's Criminal Investigation Division for assistance. The Northern Constabulary's CID was based out of Inverness, which was around 150 miles away on the mainland of the United Kingdom. The Inverness-based team took control of the situation remotely and ordered the local officers to secure the scene, take names and await their arrival on the island before proceeding any further than they had been instructed. Typically, in such circumstances, the journey from Inverness to Kirkwall would have been undertaken by helicopter. However, this was not available at the time. The team knew they had a long journey ahead of them and would have to travel up to the ferry port by car, then get a ferry from the mainland to Orkney itself. The journey took the team nearly 5 hours, with the ferry setting off across the Pentland Firth from John O'Groats, the most northerly point of the United Kingdom's mainland, before landing in Kirkwall. When they arrived in the quiet of the early morning, they were shown the crime scene. There was scant evidence to go on for the investigators. They had, most obviously, the statements of the witnesses and Shamol's body. However, with proper forensic investigators on the scene, they were able to recover some little forensic evidence to help them hunt the killer. The team recovered a single bullet casing from the floor, which the shooter had forgotten to retrieve before he ran. The investigators also located the bullet itself. When the man had shot Shamol, he had been at such close range that the bullet had actually travelled through Shamol and lodged itself within the wall behind where he stood. The shell, they could ascertain, was for a 9mm pistol. The bullet was sent to the lab to be analysed as a matter of urgency. They may have felt a stronger position had they been able to get a more specific, identifiable description of the killer and the murder weapon. While the forensic analysis of the bullet was ongoing, the police created a public appeal for further information to assist the investigation, in print, on air, and on the television. When this was publicly aired, the people of Kirkwall flooded forwards. The police conducted an island-wide search of Mainland and took details from every person they could ascertain was on or in the process of leaving Orkney at that time. This search was a mammoth task, given the incident had taken place at the height of the tourist season and required thousands of identity cards to be filled out by departing and travelling visitors to the island over the following 3 days. The boundless energy of the investigators was not to stop there. As well as collating the names of every visitor on the island, they also conducted house-to-house inquiries at every single door in Kirkwall. In the closed-door discussions, the motive was the first stop of the investigators, but Shamol Mahmood presented no apparent rationale. There had been an argument involving 2 locals and Shamol at the door of the Mumutaz before the murder, but it was proving difficult to locate the 2 unknown parties with whom Shamol had been arguing. There were a few other motives investigated by the police, such as Shamol's ethnicity, or some unknown feud from his past, or something from Kirkwall itself. Any deep thinking which the team gave to why someone would want to kill Shamol Mahmood presented far more questions than answers. Investigating officers were opening their ears and minds to whatever the possibility may be. They had received a phone call that Shamol had ran up debts down in England and that his murder was linked to that. Another grapevine story stated that he had bedded a local woman and that his murder was a revenge killing. Some others phoned in to agree with one of the police's other theories, that he had been targeted for being one of only a few Asian faces on the island by some deranged, racially motivated killer. This last potential motive gave particular concern to the Mia family who owned the Mumutaz. They were spirited away to a safe house on the island until the police could ascertain whether there was a significant threat against Asian families on the island. No matter what avenue police and journalists set off down investigating, there seemed to be no actual concrete evidence linking anyone to the murder of Shamol Mahmood. Given establishing a motive was proving troublesome, the police instead set their sights on trying to find the man who had pulled the trigger through the evidence he had left behind. If they had him in custody, something about him might jump out at them and help them establish the motive and help them to build a case against him. Some interesting tidbits did flow into the police's investigation line in this regard. A local woman who had been driving her car nearby to the Mumutaz saw a man with brown hair flash by her running down the street wearing dark clothes. The timing matched up, which gave the investigators some clue as to which route the man may have taken in his escape, should it have been the murderer having ditched his balaclava. Another local was able to provide a further statement, which placed a man in a hooded top and a balaclava at the Kiln Corner public toilets nearby to the Mumutaz around 7:10 PM, where he was loitering outside. It was particularly strange, the man had noted, as that day, June 2, was a particularly fine day in Kirkwall. The hot weather had made the man's dress sense stand out in even greater contrast. This man's statement was backed up by a further witness who saw this same man heading from the public toilets towards the Mumutaz Restaurant, and a telephone line engineer who had heard a man rustling in a cubicle within the Kiln Corner, then departing hurriedly and wearing a backpack. The man had kept his head low throughout. The murderer, it seemed, had changed into the outfit to conceal their identity only a few hundred yards from the scene of the crime, then changed back in the same toilets not long after. To the police, this gave them a suspicious feeling that it could be someone familiar with the island who had murdered Shamol Mahmood. The unfortunate fact of these sightings was that none brought them any closer to identifying who pulled the trigger. There was a potential breakthrough when a further witness stated that just over 2 hours before the crime, at 5:10 PM, he had cut down the lane adjacent to the Mumutaz. As he cut down the lane, he saw a well-built man in front of him. The man had given him a particularly menacing stare, at which the witness had felt quite threatened. He said the man looked to be somewhere around 28 years old and stood in the region of 5'8". An identifit was drawn up based on the man's description. When the identifit was released, the police encouraged the man to come forward, stating that they were looking for him to eliminate himself from their inquiries rather than incriminate him in the murder of Shamol Mahmood. Despite this, the man never came forward to the police. One of the critical features of the investigation was around the bullet recovered at the scene and trying to map it to a murder weapon. The shell was identified at the scene by an officer with a background in firearms named Eddie Ross as a 9mm 2Z round. Constable Ross held a firearms permit and was known to be the island's foremost expert on guns and ammunition. As such, he was an unofficial expert opinion within the force for any firearms-related investigations. He wasn't necessarily supposed to be within the perimeter of the Mumutaz, but the other officers were glad of his advice given his expertise. When examining the bullet, which had been recovered, Ross noted that the pin had made a particularly light indent in the bullet. 2Z rounds were a type of 9mm ammunition, which were most commonly fired from submachine guns. Submachine guns with their firing pin leave a deeper imprint on the bullets. As such, he felt the bullet had been fired from a 9mm pistol, which had not had any alterations made to fire the 2Z rounds. Ross was likely confident of the bullet's typing due to the small purple ring, called an annulus, around the primer of the bullet. Eddie Ross was informed that he was to commission a report in relation to his findings and anything else he felt could contribute to the investigation. At the time, there was a gun amnesty in Kirkwall. Gun laws were tightening across Scotland, and many of the guns which locals owned had become illegal in the aftermath of certain legislative changes, so they were left with little choice but to surrender them. Part of Eddie Ross's duties in his role as the island's de facto weapons expert involved ensuring that any firearms turned in as part of the amnesty were rendered unusable. Between his knowledge, his position in the amnesty, and the fact he was prominent within a local gun club, Eddie Ross was the obvious choice to push this aspect of the investigation along. He not only knew about weapons, he knew what weapons were on the island. Given that pistols hadn't yet been included within the banned weaponry list, Eddie Ross was given the authority to locate and seize any 9mm capable weapons on the island to test them for the capacity to shoot the type of bullets found within the Mumutaz. Eddie Ross provided a report soon after the crime to state that none of the guns which had been surrendered in the preceding months or after the crime could fire the type of ammunition recovered from the Mumutaz Restaurant. Also within his report was his opinion that the bullet had been chambered, then unchambered with a 9mm weapon multiple times before being fired. The origin of the bullet was also identified, with the KF mark on the bullet being traced to a manufacturer in India called the Kirkwall. An island-wide notice was issued that anyone who held 9mm 2Z ammunition or a 9mm capable weapon was to submit it for testing to eliminate them from the investigation. Just as the focus was increasing on the bullet and its significance, a suspect emerged. A local woman, Margaret Ralston, made a voluntary statement to the police to report that 2 weeks before the killing, on the 19th of May 1994, she had spotted a man wearing a balaclava and a hooded top in Papdale Woods. The woods were near the local secondary school, and it appeared that the young man was practicing commando moves. He was firstly hiding behind trees, bursting out from behind them, then hiding behind a wall and repeating the process. Her daughter Lynn had seen the man too, and they watched him at his practice for nearly 30 minutes, in a mixture of fear and interest. The man eventually removed the hooded top and balaclava, which enabled the woman and her daughter to give a detailed description of the man they had seen. He had short fair hair, stood about 5'7", and had a little tan about him, as if he had spent some time in the sun. Now the investigation had formed a net, and they needed to find someone to catch in it. Despite the process in June, the investigation stalled significantly throughout July, especially as Detective Superintendent Goff, who had been leading the investigation, was recalled to Inverness on the mainland. The man in Papdale Woods remained at large, and Eddie Ross had tested more weapons than one would have surmised to have been on Orkney, but none had the telltale signs associated with the one recovered from the Mumutaz. The next significant breakthrough in the investigation came from Eddie Ross himself. Listening to true crime podcasts is a great way to really get you thinking, but sometimes we all need a break. That's where puzzle game Best Fiends comes in. Skinwalker producer Matt Kay has found the perfect way to relax while editing our episodes is to take a quick break to level up through different puzzles and collect new fiends. He has now gotten to level 45 and has gotten me hooked also. Best Fiends keeps things fresh as you find new fiends and the levels get harder as you progress. They also add new levels and characters to play for monthly. Engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. On August 12, 1994, before finishing his night shift, Angus Chisholm, one of the DIs on the case, asked Ross for some keys and made some discussion into the Kirkwall arsenal so that he could arrange more of the 9mm 2Z ammunition for testing. Constable Eddie Ross replied that he could help him out, as he had a box of the same bullets at home. Chisholm stood wonderstruck, staring back at Eddie Ross. Ross, as a key figure in the inquiries, knew that a pivotal aspect of the investigations had been for locals who had this sort of ammunition to come forward so they could be eliminated from the suspect pool. Eddie Ross had not until that exact moment, over 2 months after the murder of Shamol Mahmood, come forward to say he was in possession of 9mm 2Z ammunition. This omission seemed inconceivable, especially to those who knew Eddie Ross, who was a very straight-laced and stoic army man. His performance and work as an officer had been exemplary. Conversation from him tended to be forthright and mostly focused on firearms, his work, or his time spent serving in the army. When Chisholm overcame his surprise, he quizzed Ross on where he had come into the ownership of the ammunition. Ross initially stated he couldn't remember when he had come into its ownership. A driver was then sent with Ross, who was not under any suspicion or police caution at the time, to collect the box from his home in the parish of St Ola in Kirkwall. DI Angus Chisholm firmly reminded Ross it was of the utmost importance that he established where and when he had come into the ownership of this ammunition at the earliest possible juncture. When he next reported to the station, Ross stated that he recalled the circumstances of his ownership. He had been given the bullets by a man named James Spence. Spence was a local man who had been a Royal Marine in his youth. Spence, who was now working as a manual labourer, kept true to his military roots by supporting the British Legion, an organisation of which Eddie Ross too was a member. Spence would drink in the clubhouse bar which Eddie Ross frequented. One evening in 1984, Ross's story went, the two were drinking when the subject came round to firearms, a favourite topic of Eddie Ross. James Spence mentioned that he had taken a box of 9mm ammo with him from his locker when he had finished his service, for which no reason was given. He soon realised he did not have a licence to own the bullets, so had left them in a cupboard awaiting an opportunity to dispose of them. When he realised Eddie Ross was the perfect man to provide them to, as he could either legally dispose of them or make use of them with his legally held guns at a firing range, he offered the bullets to him. Eddie Ross accepted and took possession of the ammunition in a quiet meeting in a local car park. Ross went on to explain that he kept the ammunition safely within his locked home armoury, which was secure and regularly inspected. When Spence was brought in for questioning, he gave a broadly similar statement to the one which Eddie Ross recalled, and confirmed that he had given 2 boxes of ammunition to Ross, 1 box of the 9mm and 1 being .22mm bullets. The police noted with interest that Eddie Ross had only noted the 9mm and had concealed the fact that James Spence had also provided him with .22mm ammunition. Eddie Ross's reputation had protected him in the early stages of his admission, but there was significant suspicion falling on him as the days progressed. While the investigations were ongoing into Eddie Ross and the 9mm 2Z ammunition, on September 8, 1994, a call was brought in to the chief investigator on Kirkwall. It was the witness who had seen the man in Papdale Woods as he conducted his commando acts in a balaclava, Margaret Railston. Margaret had phoned the police to state that she had seen the man from the woods again, this time in a bakery on Kirkwall's Main Street, just before she had called in. When investigations led the team to the bakery, there were no images of the man she had identified. They did, however, by a turn of fate, spot the man once again in the town centre. The man stood across the road from where they were. Only, he wasn't a man as such. It was a teenager. A 15-year-old lad named Michael Ross. The son of Eddie Ross, the firearms expert. The same Eddie Ross who had been under increasing scrutiny due to his behaviour in relation to possessing the same type of ammunition which was used in the murder of Shamol Mahmood. Michael Ross had, as described by the witness, short fair hair and stood about 5'7" tall. The police felt they now had their suspect. The Ross family were informed of the investigations, now focusing firmly on their son, and local police officers brought the young Ross in for questioning. The family could feel the pressure heat coming on hot. Michael Ross had been born on August 28, 1978, within a few years of his father's return to Orkney from service in Ireland. When his father spoke of the war, he would hang on his every word. When only in his early teens, Michael was already dressing like he was in the army. He would wear army-style overshirts and trousers and brightly shone black combat boots. He was treated like he was in the army too. When his father spoke of what being a man meant and toughness, Michael would test his resolve. Despite his youth, he would be loaded into the family car and dropped 5 or more miles from the family house with nothing but water, a map and a compass. Eddie Ross would then drive off and leave the young Michael to fend for himself and find his way home. The young lad would always find his way home, often sodden to the skin by the time he had managed to return. He was understandably an exemplary member of his army cadet scheme. Eddie also taught the young Michael how to shoot firearms, involving him under strict supervision at the gun club. Safety was pivotal, and much was given to the demonstration of how to respect and treat the gun, bullets and gunpowder at the will of his finger. His mother Moira didn't seem to mind any of it. From the navigation tests through to the gun use, island boys must be tough. Proud, patriotic and fearless, Michael Ross was a man when he was only a boy. The only interesting aspect of Michael Ross, which was not formulated by his association with his father and his methods, was his love of metal band Megadeth. The fans of Megadeth are wide-ranging, but there has been a consistent racist element and Nazi-associated ideology within a small hardcore group of their fans. Around a year prior to the death of Shamol Mahmood, he had taken to increasingly listening to their music in his bedroom, using earphones so as not to alert his father. His classmates at his Kirkwall High School too had noticed he had taken to drawing swastikas on his school notebooks and occasionally said racist or borderline racist things. One such notebook was recovered at the family home during a search. As well as Nazi imagery, it had anti-English slogans engraved into the paper. Interestingly, Eddie Ross too had a collection of Nazi propaganda material from the war period, books on the history of the Nazi Party, and, allegedly, memorabilia. Eddie Ross stated he had these due to an interest in military history and not for more sinister purposes. He also fundamentally disagreed with any argument that he was a racist, stating he was in direct opposition with the views of the British National Party, a British right-wing political party who had long been the recipient of allegations of racism for their actions. Whether Michael's interest was similarly academic remained to be seen. When brought in for questioning, Michael Ross was not initially asked about his actions in connection with the murder of Shamol Mahmood. The investigating officers instead brought up the incident within Papdale Woods, where someone matching his description was seen performing commando moves within the trees, wearing a balaclava. The young Ross denied having acted in such a way in Papdale Woods. When the investigating officers noted with interest that a man in similar clothing had been involved in the murder of Shamol Mahmood, Michael Ross distanced himself further. Michael's extramural army-style training from his father was not known to the investigators, but they did know that he was an army cadet. Drilling the so-called commando moves he was performing may have had a perfectly reasonable explanation within this context. Still, Michael Ross denied it was him who had been in Papdale Woods. He produced an alibi that he was cycling around a nearby estate on the night in question. This supposed alibi did not stand up to scrutiny when officers interviewed the locals whom Ross said could vouch for where he had been at the time in question. But the young Ross said little to incriminate himself and had to be released. During the interview, Michael Ross was not informed he had been formally identified, and he was released, although not freed from the suspicion of the crime. With his father's training keeping him composed under pressure, the 16-year-old looked as cool under investigation as any career criminal. The police were still certain this was their man. They needed to pressure the young Ross to make him make a mistake. So, as they released Michael Ross from the station, a separate plan was in place to ensure the two could not collude any further. Eddie Ross, the investigators now firmly believed, deliberately obscured an investigation to prevent the focus of blame falling on his son. Several requests were made of the Ross family. They had to turn in several of their guns for testing, and they were frequently contacted to advise on issues of interest. Nothing led to any further commitment by the police, but the family may have felt a noose was tightening in around them. Eddie and Michael Ross were returned to be questioned on December 2. Within this interview, Michael Ross admitted that it had in fact been him who was performing military manoeuvres in Papdale Woods, but categorically denied any involvement in the murder of Shamol Mahmood. He instead stated his motives were to exact revenge on someone who had been acting inappropriately towards one of his ex-girlfriends. In any event, the young Ross mentioned the boy never showed, and he had simply went home. When police conducted inquiries, they found the lad in question did exist, but he had left school several months prior to the date at which Michael Ross had been observed in Papdale Woods. After the discussions about Papdale Woods, they turned their focus to the evening of Shamol Mahmood's murder. When pressed on his location that evening, Ross pointed out a number of places he had been, but categorically denied being anywhere near Bridge Street on that date entirely. Again, the police were forced to release both men without charge. In the course of re-interviewing persons of interest, James Spence was brought back in for questioning. This time, Spence amended his statement. He stated he had actually provided 2 boxes of 9mm bullets to Eddie Ross. One of these boxes had the seal broken when he had transferred to Ross's ownership. Investigators felt they were now close. They turned the heat up, quizzing James Spence on the differences in his testimony between his first and second statement. A string was added to the investigators' bows when James Spence stated that prior to being brought in for questioning in the first instance, Eddie Ross had spoken to him to ensure that his testimony would mention only one of the boxes of 9mm 2Z ammunition which he had provided. James Spence was charged, but told his cooperation in securing a conviction against Eddie Ross would ensure these went away. In early January of 1995, Michael Ross was arrested in relation to the murder of Shamsuddin Shamol Mahmood. An identity parade was set up with all of the street witnesses, save for those who had observed Michael Ross in Papdale Woods. When none of them managed to pinpoint Michael Ross, the police nonetheless submitted a request to prosecute to the Procurator Fiscal. The Fiscal outright denied the application, stating that on the current evidence there was no reasonable prospect of a conviction. It was an argument of proof rather than guilt. The same outcome happened again after a further round of evidence gathering in August of 1995. The prosecutor was unwilling to take on the case unless it was watertight. Before this point had been reached, Michael Ross departed from Kirkwall, aged 17, to join the Black Watch in the British Army. With their fingers now burnt, the investigators were determined to secure the arrest of at least one of the Ross family. Eddie Ross had already been suspended from his role in the police in March of 1995, and belief in the two men's guilt was divisive across the island. By March of 1997, 2 years after his initial suspension, and with his son off serving in the army, Eddie Ross was charged with concealing evidence in relation to Shamol Mahmood's murder and ownership of an unconnected handgun. He was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment for his crimes, to be served in Porterfield Prison. More concerningly, his conviction allowed his son's name to be dragged into connection with the murder. Eddie Ross had noted such an outcome was his worst fear. He had also stated that even he had concerns about his son's potential guilt at times, given some of the circumstances his son had found himself in. In considering this, he stated, however, that he had always been swayed by the fact that if Michael had been guilty, surely the police would have found enough evidence of his guilt to convince a prosecutor to charge him. His son Michael, however, was not concerned with any such implication. He was more upset with the conviction of his father, who despite his harsh treatment was one of his closest friends. He doubled down on his time in the army, ensuring his father would at least be able to take solace in his performance as a soldier, putting their training into practice. As his son was rising up the ranks in the army, Eddie Ross was focused on being an exemplary prisoner. Within 2 years, Eddie Ross was released and began working as a caretaker in a local funeral home, and Michael was a shining light in his unit, with great things expected of his service. On one break from service, Michael Ross, who was by now a firearms instructor in the Black Watch, married a local Kirkwall girl, and the pair began a new family life in army accommodation in Inverness on the mainland when he wasn't on service. When he was on service, he was marked for greatness. His marksmanship made him an obvious choice for a unit sniper. He was serving in Iraq, ensuring the men of his unit weren't picked off by Taliban snipers on the other side. With his own firearms talent, it is undoubted he picked up a few enemy scalps while he served. In 2004, Michael Ross's unit were ambushed by an IED while on active service in North Babley. Members of his unit credit their survival on his leadership skills and coolness under pressure. He administered life-saving first aid and ensured they returned safely to their barracks. His conduct earned him a named mention on dispatches. Michael Ross was then deployed to Fallujah at the height of the conflict, where he again distinguished himself with his service. Michael Ross was the sole reason many of his unit made it home to see their families. He was a war hero, and no doubting it. He was also still the main and only suspect in the murder of Shamol Mahmood. In September of 2006, a man walked into Kirkwall's police station and handed over an anonymous note. Within the note, there was an allegation that the offer had seen a man in kiln corner toilets on the evening Shamol Mahmood was murdered. The man was Michael Ross, and he was brandishing a pistol in his hand. The man who had handed in the supposedly anonymous note was identified as a local Willie Grant. The note was not anonymous, but autobiographical. When Willie Grant was brought in for questioning about his note, he confirmed it had indeed been him who had witnessed Michael Ross brandishing a pistol, having changed within the kiln corner toilets. He also dropped a further bombshell. He had been a witness to the racial abuse of Shamol Mahmood outside the Mumutaz 2 nights prior to his murder. The youth who was hurling the racial slurs and threatened to shoot Shamol was indeed Michael Ross. Word reached the Rosses that Willie Grant had made a statement incriminating Michael. Willie Grant said this began a period of intimidation for him on Orkney, with the intimidation going as far as him receiving death threats in a local pub. As the investigation progressed, with the new testimony from Willie Grant at its heart, the Fiscal's office in Inverness were finally convinced. An arrest warrant would be issued, with their consent to bring Michael Ross in on charges related to the murder of Shamol Mahmood. Less than 1 month later, a dawn raid was undertaken at the Northern Irish barracks where Michael Ross was being held. He came in quietly and was officially charged. Likely due to his heroic conduct within the military, Michael Ross was, unusually for such a severe murder trial, granted bail while the prosecution prepared arguments. However, the day loomed. With a date set for mid-May, Michael Ross was abundantly aware that the police believed they had finally supplied the prosecution with enough evidence, albeit circumstantial, to form a picture of a guilty man. A guilty man who had rehearsed his actions in Papdale Woods, then enacted them in the Mumutaz Restaurant 14 years previously. Now 29, Michael Ross took his place in the dock on May 15, 2008. He looked every inch the army man, in a sharp black pinstriped suit. His strong square jaw and close-cropped hair spoke to his military precision. He sat unflinching as the charges were read, and eyed the court presumptively. Michael Ross was a man who knew how to be unflinching under pressure. He had proven that in his youth, when he had orienteered himself through the wild Orkney climbs to return home when his father had left him alone to toughen him up. He had proven that when the IED had blown his army vehicle sky high, he had the composure to administer first aid, while most around him could barely think. His character was shown again when his unit was dispatched to the hell on earth that was Fallujah. This was not a man who was going to be intimidated by the court system. When arguments were underway, the case revolved around several key points. Willie Grant's new testimony pointed to Michael Ross being the man in kiln corner toilets and had him holding a murder weapon. Michael Ross, unfazed by his identification, presented an unproven alibi which had him in an entirely separate part of Mainland on the evening in question. Surrounding testimony from those who knew Michael Ross indicated that he was willing to use racist terminology and often scribbled Nazi iconography. This testimony did not, however, state for certain that he himself was a racist, or at least was not willing to murder someone for any racist views he did hold. Eddie Ross also took the stand to state that the testimony of James Spence was incorrect, and he had only ever been provided one box of the 9mm ammunition, which he had provided to the investigators with the seal unbroken. If he only had one box, it would dent any accusations into Michael Ross's guilt, given he would have had little to no access to such bullets. It would also, as Donald Finlay QC, who was defending Michael Ross, pointed out, show that Eddie Ross had been a victim of a miscarriage of justice himself. One of the smoking gun pieces of evidence which supported the testimony of Willie Grant was the testimony provided by an anonymous witness, which stated Michael Ross had stated to his youth cohort in the Army Cadets that, quote, blacks should be shot and have a gun put to their head. A similarly disturbing accusation was made that when attending a function, another soldier had asked Michael Ross about his guilt, to which he replied he was, of course, guilty, but his father had taken care of the evidence. The prosecution freely admitted they lacked the single piece of physical evidence which would have by itself sunk Michael Ross's defence. They did, however, ask a question. The question was, how unlucky can one person be? It seemed so highly improbable that every signpost can point to one man, and that one man can be innocent. The defence rebutted this, stating the man they were portraying Michael Ross to be was not some unfeeling assassin, but a family man and a war hero. Michael Ross returned the following day. The jury of 5 men and 10 women had reached a majority decision. Michael Ross was found guilty of murder and told he would be remanded in custody to receive his sentence on July 11 that same year. Michael Ross eyed the judge intently, then, with almost Herculean strength, threw the officer attending at his side to the floor and made a break for the court doors. He made for a door, then set off down the corridor for an available fire escape. As he neared it, Gordon Morrison, one of the court officers, cut Michael Ross off and tackled him to the floor. While the 2 men struggled, reinforcements made their way over and subdued Michael Ross. Investigations afterwards discovered that Michael Ross had in fact concealed a Scorpion machine gun, which he had smuggled home from Kosovo, and 545 rounds of ammo, a grenade, smoke bombs, knives, air rifle, and camouflage gear in a rental car he had hidden near the court in a Tesco car park. He argued that he had planned to use them to live a life off-grid. However, many feared he had planned a killing spree in the event he had been convicted. Despite his getaway attempt, Michael Ross was handcuffed and returned to custody. In July of that year, Michael Ross was sentenced to 25 years, plus an additional 5 years for his escape attempt. He was sent to Her Majesty's Prison in Shotts, Scotland's maximum security prison, to serve his sentence. Given the lack of physical forensic evidence linking Michael Ross to the crime, there is a significant pressure group within Orkney who believe Michael Ross has been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. Ross himself stated a number of years after his conviction, they knitted two things together, those being the bullets and Michael with the balaclava in Papdale Woods, and you have a beautiful stew. If you look at it from their point of view and the way it is presented in court, I would have found myself guilty. The group have made numerous attempts to have Michael's case re-evaluated, but have failed from a legal perspective. As it stands, there is no will from the police to re-investigate, as they firmly stand behind the conviction of Michael Ross by a jury of his peers at Glasgow High Court in 2008. Shamsuddin Shamol Mahmood's brother, Abul Shafiuddin, at the time of the conviction being 63 years old, believes justice was done and felt the police had given his family a great service by bringing his killer to justice in May of 2008.